The first thing the sea returned was not bone or shipwreck but a lattice of metal so intricately worked that the word, ruin, seemed insolent when applied to it. It lay half-buried where the waves folded against the jagged strand of Levantine coast that maps called insignificant, a smear of rock and scrub between the mouth of a drowned valley and the low hills that had once sheltered a trading post. For a century the cove had been a place fishermen avoided for its sudden shoals and weird eddies. It would become, in a matter of weeks, a place nations watched. Dr. Miriam Halaby found the lattice on a bright April morning with the salt of the sea hung like a second skin on her hair. She was not looking for artifacts. No archaeologist ever planned for the exact ecstatic moment when history unveiled a fragment of itself, but for botanical samples of coastal flora, the kind of slow, careful work that subsidized more sensational projects. A storm had tumbled the sandstone. The tide had slipped away a patch of black seaweed. Under the wet grit, the metal glinted like a secret. Miriam was 62, slight and spare, a woman in whose face an unglamorous life of fieldwork had drawn careful lines. She had the tired, incurable patience of a person who had waited out seasons, colleagues, fads, and funding cycles. At the museum in the old quarter she kept a Greek coin in a desk drawer and a photograph of a ruin in Anatolia that she had visited as a young scholar, both reminders that the past never surrendered its riddles easily. She plucked the lattice free with gloved fingers, and it did not clatter like a modern contrivance but hummed with the quiet insistence of deliberate design. The lattice was not wholly metal. Within its bronze-like filigree lay glass tubes, long and slender, some ruptured but others intact, their interiors lined with a residue that caught and fractured the morning sun into faint auroras. The metals, analysis would later call some of them copper alloys and others something that resisted simple naming, were hammered with joints and pins precise enough to suggest machining, not crude smithing. The pattern of the lattice was nothing Roman, nothing Byzantine. Its geometry hinted at knowledge of arcs and harmonics that felt anachronistic on this wind-slapped shoreline. Word of the find moved like a contagion through the small coastal city. Local officials scrambled, the museum hurried to inventory, and journalists, always hungry for the romance of discovery, arrived with lenses and shorthand notebooks. Within 10 days, teams from 2 universities and a consortium of independent scholars were on site, metallurgists, historians of ancient tides, and a paleotechnologist named Elias Kofi, whose papers on pre-modern manufacturing had been dismissed as imaginative until fieldwork proved otherwise. Beneath the scaffolding and guarded tarpaulins, the lattice yielded other artifacts, a carved stone disc etched with spiral motifs that resembled both the Bronze Age sun emblems and a schematic map, a small bronze prism that fit into the lattice as though it were part of a machine. Fragments of a brittle codex inscribed on a waxed wooden slat in a script not found in any known lexicon but with numerals that corresponded eerily to astronomical cycles. Miriam's careful mind moved through comparison and possibility, a navigational instrument for long voyages, an astronomical calculator, a ceremonial object engineered with astonishing craftsmanship. The government favored the language of national treasure, the international press whispered. Ancient technology. The implications threaded into the fabric of academic politics. If the lattice represented a technological practice unknown to the recorded cultures of the region, then histories of seafaring and metallurgy might be rearranged. If it hinted at a lost school of engineering, an artisan guild or a civilization that had abstracted technology into philosophy, then the world would have to contend with a new lineage of human ingenuity. They named the site at first for the cove, Catter's Reach, and then, more solemnly, for a local myth, the Sea Singer's Hollow. The name stuck. Grants followed, so did powers that be, and with them the grudging hand of geopolitics. Artifacts were catalogued under heavy watch. The lattice was moved to a climate-controlled room guarded like an embassy. Fingerprints, maps of the dig, and the beginning of 1,000 hypotheses circulated, some as scholarly as they were speculative, others fervently conspiratorial. Elias Kofi argued, bluntly and without ceremony, that the lattice was not merely old but out of sequence. It has no parallel in the Levant until the Hellenistic period, he said in a meeting at the museum. And yet the metallurgy suggests an empirical knowledge of tensile stress and resonant cavities that would place its makers in sympathy with artisans who understood harmonic engineering, people who shouldn't exist here, at this time. From Cairo, Dr. Rania Farouk, an epigrapher whose specialty was late Bronze Age trade languages, sent photographs of the incised numerals. She would later mail Miriam 3 pages of meticulous comparison, small glyphs that matched patterns carved into a tomb in Crete, and oddly, into the casing of a Roman-era water clock unearthed near Ephesus. The evidence, if stitched carefully, made a kind of dreadful, exhilarating sense, a network of knowledge coursing through the Mediterranean, thin as a thread, patchy but persistent, connecting artisans who transmitted ideas across a millennium. But knowledge alone is not proof, and the lattice resisted neat classification. When Elias ran a microprobe and produced a spectrum, it revealed an alloy with trace elements uncommon in Bronze Age smelting. The glass tubes, when examined under polarized light, contained bubbles aligned as if something with electrical charge, carried over epochs in a desert of silence, had once flowed within them. Yet there was no obvious source of power, no batteries, no fuel residues. The object suggested a technology so different that modern analogies felt partial, like trying to explain color to someone born in darkness. By the time the first small international conference convened in the museum's lecture hall, the lattice had already become myth and magnet. The opening day was full of small epiphanies. A tree ring specialist from the north found that a wooden peg matched timber growth rings from the 30th year BC. A geologist traced the metal's isotopic signature to a specific seam in Anatolia that had been mined intermittently for millennia. The narrative that began to coalesce was beguiling, an object forged at the intersection of trade routes, carried by mariners, altered across hands and centuries, and then lost to the sea in an unknown storm. During a late-night walk along the harbor, after lectures, after the clinking of glass and polite receptions, Miriam spoke to Jonah Hale, a documentary filmmaker who had arrived with equipment but no pretense of predicting the future. Jonah's camera had already begun to hate him, capturing faces that, in the flicker of film, receded into archetype. He had a habit of asking blunt questions and listening to the echo. "What do you think it is?" he asked Miriam, as gulls cried over the quay. She said what every scientist and fool said in such instances, that it was a signpost, not a sentence. "It tells us someone knew something," she answered. "How to harness properties of materials in ways we have yet to translate." "And does anyone want that translated?" Jonah prodded. "Of course." Miriam's voice sharpened. "Universities. Governments. Private collectors. There are always people who want answers as much as they want the power that knowledge grants." Jonah studied the lattice's briefcase-shaped case at the museum the next morning, its foam lining, its seals. He had the media's lightness to his advantage. No one suspected him of seriousness, so they trusted him enough to show him what they would not show a stranger from a certain office in a certain capital. He filmed the lattice, close-ups of the glass tubes refracting light like frozen rainbows, and he recorded, with an artist's patience, the faces of the researchers as they touched it. Their reverence was less for the object than for the promise of meaning. Meaning is a contagion. It turned the quiet work of analysis into a competition of narratives. A faction within the consortium argued the lattice was an astrolabe, a precision instrument used for celestial navigation whose production had been refined earlier than the records showed. Another declared it a machine of ritual resonance, a singer's lattice, meant to produce tones and petitions to the sea. A small, more radical group, mostly metallurgists and theoretical physicists, suggested the lattice was a transducer of seawater and tidal energy, exploiting gradients between salt concentration and air pressure to create microcurrents within its glass tubes. Miriam heard these theories catch and scatter in the air like moths. She preferred to let the lattice speak through experiments. Under the fluorescence of the lab, technicians fed tiny, controlled currents through replica circuits. They spun the glass tubes and tested acoustic responses, measured ion flows, and exposed the residue inside the tubes to solutions. The residue, organic carbonaceous, was later identified as derived from a polyunsaturated marine oil stabilized with plant tannins. This suggested not only a functional continuity with maritime culture but a sophistication of chemical processing that blurred the lines between artisan and chemist. The turning point came when a doctoral candidate named Noor, who had the sort of light-step curiosity that made people indispensable, noticed a set of micro-etchings within the prism. Under magnification, the prism's faces resolved into not decoration but a map, arcs and vector lines that, when overlaid with tidal charts, corresponded to the mouth of a river now drowned under a delta. Noor's discovery reframed the lattice not as isolated instrument but as component in a network, a node in a coastal system that had once interfaced with the sea in ways the living had forgotten. Imagine a chain of these across a coastline, Noor said at the lab meeting, her voice low. A system that could, perhaps, regulate currents, or map subsea topography, or even, this is wild, harvest energy from tidal shifts at a scale we haven't considered. The room held its breath. Noor did not mean to sound triumphant. Her thesis was cautious. A chain of devices, each tuned to local bathymetries, could create standing waves or manipulate flows. The idea was at once plausible and extravagant. If true, it would imply a coordinated engineering tradition, a maritime intelligence that paced with an acuity usually credited to later industrial societies. As they followed coordinated lines of evidence, stratigraphy of coastal deposits, isotopic traces matched to distant mines, coded spiral numbers suggesting synchronized calendars, the faces of the research team sharpened with the electricity of hypothesis. The city's mayor, sensing the global interest, declared the site a cultural heritage zone. Patrols were increased. Private security firms began to ring the museum's perimeters with men whose fastness suggested other governments had their eyes on Qatar's reach. It was then that the first theft occurred. No alarm blared, no camera showed the intruder's face. A single glass tube disappeared from the lattice's case during a shift change, a wink of absence in a locked room. The theft was not raw theft for sale. The tube was too fragile, too coded, its value lay in context. Whoever took it understood its role. They had not wanted a trophy, they had wanted data. The city was small enough that secrets did not disappear easily. Someone, no one would confess how, though Jonah would later hint at a network of fishermen with ears in every cove, saw a gray boat glide at dawn along the jagged coast, a white box craned in gentle hands. The images, grainy and partial, were the sort of thing movie makers circulate until fiction and evidence blur. Investigators found a pattern of footprints in wet sand and crude, professional implements left in a shallow cave. They could not identify the thief, but they deduced the work of someone precise, someone who valued the tube's informational geometry more than its monetary value. The theft changed the tenor of everything. The consortium tightened its rules, the museum refused press access, and the list of people given clearance narrowed until it included only those with the most airtight credentials. Politics, not theory, began to dictate who handled the lattice. Miriam found herself staring at a map pinned to the museum wall, red strings tied to known shipwrecks and trade routes. She sat up late with Noor, tracing the strings with a pale finger. "If this is a technology," she said, "then someone lost the thread. Or someone buried it." Noor, younger and wilder and full of the peculiar bravado of those who have nothing to lose professionally, looked at Miriam as if not, perhaps, believing in burying but in recovery. "Maybe it was buried so deliberately because it could be dangerous," she said. "A tidal regulator in the wrong hands. A machine that could change currents." Miriam finished, never one to let a phrase pass unexamined. "Imagine changing trade patterns overnight. Imagine starving a port into oblivion by altering shoals. These are weapons as much as tools. And where there is a weapon, someone seeks to control it." Within days of the tube's disappearance, anonymous letters arrived at the museum, each printed with careful, archaic script, quoting a passage from a lost maritime song. "Do not remove the song from the shore," one read. It sounded fanciful and menacing, as if the past itself had raised a voice against being disturbed. Elias thought the letters were likely a modern affectation, a group using myth to cover private motives. Others thought otherwise. A whisper circulated of a brotherhood of mariners, a subset of a guild that had survived under layers of oral tradition and local pacts, custodians of a technology made not for domination but for stewardship. The idea was romantic and, in the civilized rooms of academia, dangerously naive, yet the letters had the effect of reframing the lattice as not merely an object of study but a talisman with guardians. The public's appetite for drama escalated. International outlets sent correspondents who spun the lattice into a narrative that combined treasure and thriller. Ancient energy device? Blared one headline. Lost genius of the sea? Asked another. Conspiracy forums proliferated, the lattice as Atlantean relic, as proof of ancient extraterrestrial contact, as the missing link in a technological timeline. But reality is a more sober animal. The lattice, stripped of fanfare and rumor, remained what it could be measured to be. The work continued, slower, punctuated by setbacks, corrosion that refused to stop, funding bureaucracies that tangled necessary permits, the occasional false lead that chewed time. Yet even amid these frustrations someone, nor usually, would make a marginal note in the leather notebook she carried. Follow prism etchings compare with tidal map. It was in one of these late-night sessions that a small and ordinary miracle occurred. Nor, poring over seafloor surveys provided by a hydrographic team, overlaid the prism's etchings onto modern sonar maps and found a match. The arcs traced a submerged shelf, and at one nodal point there was a depression in the seabed that the sonar resolved into the shadow of a structure, linear and regular, not natural. A foundation, Nor breathed. A foundation for what? Miriam asked, but the word was rhetorical. They both knew. They assembled a dive team. The sea, which had returned the lattice to their attention, now offered up another of its hushes, the opportunity to answer a question, or at least to ask it aloud before the water closed. The dive was careful and small. The team descended through the green twilight into the cold hush where sunlight became a rumor. Underwater, the structure lay like the ribs of something large and patient. It was made of quarried stone, set in interlocking blocks, and along its sides were niches that once held fittings, metal fixtures whose corrosion bore hallmarks similar to the lattice. The scale suggested infrastructure, not a single device but a built environment tuned to the sea. When they surfaced, salt in their mouths and the taste of the deep on their tongues, the team did not speak the obvious. It was not that they refused to say the word, harbor. It was that their training made them distrustful of certainty. Instead they sent photographs, sonar traces, and meticulously logged coordinates to the museum and to the governing body. The structure on the seabed had the look of a man-made amphora of stone, a harbor, an array, a grid. This new evidence rippled outward. It secured grants. It drew the attention of an international naval archaeology institute, which offered to send remote-operated vehicles to map the site in detail. It also drew, more ominously, men in suits who professed to represent philanthropies and private interests. They were smooth and officious, and they asked implacable questions about access and rights. Who claimed this first? One of the men asked Miriam, leaning in an office that smelled of new leather and older secrets. You mean rightful ownership? Miriam's voice was dry. Claim or custodianship? The law of antiquities is clear. This is state property. The man smiled like someone who had walked around clarity before and found it inconvenient. And if the state's interests align with private assistance? We can help ensure the site is preserved and used. Used. The word felt like a blade. Miriam, who had spent half her life trying to make the past speak honestly, had finally to confess that the past was porous. Others, the powerful, the greedy, the well-meaning with agendas, could and would transform discovery into leverage. That night, when she could no longer sleep, Miriam walked the harbor with Jonah. The city's lights had begun to look like stars made cheap by proximity. Jonah's camera rested against his chest like a quiet animal. Do you ever think we are out of time? Jonah asked. That we're a generation that found the edges of things and then forgot how to care for them? Miriam considered the lattice, the prism, the submerged structure. I think history keeps offering us experiences, she said. Sometimes we take them as gifts, sometimes as property. But the true danger is not the artifact but what we decide to do with it. They did not yet know how dangerous it could be. They did not yet know that the lattice's design, its mathematics of resonance and flow, could be misapplied by those who thought in profit or power. They did not yet know that the theft of one glass tube was the first ripple in an invisible tidal force that would draw them into a deeper conspiracy, one knitted into maritime guilds, secret custodial orders, and the ambitions of modern empires. For now, there was only the thrill of discovery, the slow, absorbing work that made time evaporate. They had found an artifact that asked more questions than it answered, a perfect provocation to scholarship. Outside, the sea slatted against the quay, indifferent and ancient, as if it had been waiting all along to reveal those aspects of its memory that it thought the living might deserve. And beneath the waves, in the shadowed grid of stone, the lattice's sisters, if sisters they were, lay in their niches. They were each one a small promise encoded by an unknown hand, of currents harnessed, of routes mapped, of energies glimpsed and then retreated from. The promise hummed faintly, not in sound but in the mathematical symmetry of their placement, a whisper that suggested order beneath chaos. When the morning came, the city awoke to a headline that would be remembered not only for its breathless tone but for the tremor it set off. Underwater structure discovered, ancient technology linked to revealed device. The future, journals wrote, was suddenly an archaeology. The past was no longer a field of study but a source of disruptive possibility. Miriam read the headline at the breakfast table, her hands wrapped around a cup that had cooled. She had never wanted fame, she had wanted clarity. But the two had become adjacent, and that adjacency would prove a hazardous place to stand. She thought of Noor's marginal notes, of the prism's etchings, of the glass tubes stolen in the dark, and of the letters with their old mythic script. In the neat column of her mind a new question took shape, as precise and delicate as a filament. Who had originally built the lattice, and for what purpose? The answer, she suspected, would be entangled with human motives, survival, commerce, ceremony, and with the fragility of trust between those who keep and those who seek. She rose from the table and walked to the museum. The sun that day dropped a hard, bright light across the courtyard. The lattice lay within its secure cage, and Noor was already at the micrograph station, her slender fingers stained with ink. Miriam watched her study the prism and the maps and felt, with that old, quiet hunger that had led her into archaeology, the first true shiver of a mystery that might change not only an understanding of technology, but the way people measured their relationship to the sea. They would not solve it that month. They might not solve it within their lifetimes. But the lattice had opened a door through which the present might step uncomfortably into the past. Outside, gulls called a language older than most treaties, and the sea moved, indifferent, as if waiting to see what those who now held its secret would do next. They called a press blackout. No one followed it. Within a week of the dive, the city's rhythm shifted into a new tempo, cameras parked like gulls on rooftops, diplomats offering statements that claimed only cautious curiosity, and men in well-cut suits who used phrases like strategic interests and shared heritage, the way others might use a prayer. Miriam learned quickly how language bent to desire. She learned, too, how fragile the little protocols of scholarship became under weighty hands. Noor's discovery, the grid on the seabed, the niches, the suggestion of an array, had drawn lines on maps that connected to more than geology. Those nodal points lay, faintly, along ancient trade currents, a necklace of small ports, agorae, and promontories known to Hittite merchants, Phoenician sailors, and later Roman mariners. Each site, when examined closely, bore the same motif in odd places, spiral etchings hidden in lintels, a chipped stone with matching numerals, a fisherman's talisman with a symbol resembling the prism's micro-etchings. Noor pursued these threads with that one-track obsession of the young scholar who perceives a pattern others dismiss as coincidence. She petitioned for access to provincial archives and old shipping logs, and while some librarians were helpful, others closed their books on her with protective care. It was in a catalog from a now-empty trading post, pages browned and ink smudged by the thumb of time, that she found a single notation, a merchant's margin comment from a year reckoned in a foreign hand. Keepers of the song at the southern shelf, give passage to none. The phrase, "keepers of the song," ricocheted through Nora like an unexpected chord. She cross-referenced it with an oral history interview recorded in 1954 with an old mariner named Samir Haddad, who had died a decade earlier. The archive's digitized file was grainy, his voice was a dry reed, but the words were intact. "We know the chorus of the water," Samir had said. "My father taught me where not to anchor. There are men who listen to the tides like you would listen to a story. They call it the song. They said, the sea has a memory, and it remembers better than we do." Miriam read Noor's transcript with hands that trembled, an archaeologist's trembling, the kind that is both fear and hunger. The notion that custodianship had passed through oral traditions, threaded into fishermen's warnings and merchants' margins, was both comforting and dangerous. Custodianship implied knowledge of use and restraint. Custodianship suggested agreements, pacts, and inevitably, those who might break them. Elias Kofi, whose bluntness could soften into the tenderness of a man devoted to metal and math, grew increasingly anxious. "If someone understood resonance and flow well enough to build one lattice," he said at a meeting in the lab, "then they could scale that principle. Not into something miraculous, into something practical. We are not only dealing with memory, we are dealing with tacit engineering. No tacit engineering exists in a vacuum," Miriam answered. "There must have been institutions, workshops, schools, perhaps guilds that handed down techniques. We need to find their paper trail, if any remains." Finding a paper trail in this context required imagination as much as method. The Mediterranean and its coasts were palimpsests of conquest. Hittite tablets scratched with business accounts lay under Roman mosaics, which in turn hid Byzantine inscriptions. Nor pursued mortar and ledger alike. She pried at coastal libraries and small museums. In a monastery archive that smelled of candle wax and mildew, she found a sketch in a 9th century margin, a crude circle with radial lines and a notation that translated, awkwardly, into "keepers of the low songs." The scribe's hand showed reverence, not technical detail. The sketch suggested a memory that had passed into metaphor. While the scholars chased ghosts on paper, something less scholarly, and far more pragmatic, was happening in rooms with heavy doors. The glass tube that had disappeared from the museum surfaced months later in a lab far from the coast, not in a museum, but in the private compound of a man whose name had been whispered through corridors as a possible patron. Darian Al-Faraj, an aerospace entrepreneur who had made his fortune in desalination and logistics. Darian cultivated the sort of philanthropy that bought access and influence. He financed small museums, endowed chairs, and had a taste for the archaeological sublime. A courier with apologetic eyes delivered the tube to a remote facility. Darian's engineers, unfamiliar with the delicate hands of conservators, set the specimen on a workbench and surrounded it with instrumentation the museum's lab did not possess. They were, in effect, attempting to read a script in a language whose grammar they did not fully know. They fired probes. They sought to stimulate the tube. The device, men described later, emitted an almost imperceptible hum, not audible as music so much as felt, a pressure in the bones like the first minutes of a storm. What it did when stimulated was modest and terrifying in equal parts. Around the compound's private marina, a small inlet lined with pilot boats, water lilted in odd, localized patterns. Small craft rocked with a strange syncopation. Floating buoys traced elliptical paths they had not before. Two fishermen who had been watching from the breakwater described feeling the water think under their keel. A licensed engineer who toured the site later would call the phenomenon a localized modulation of wave vectors, and that sterile term would haunt more than one meeting. The compound's security team, untrained for metaphysical nuance, panicked when a sudden, small current sucked at one of their patrol boats. The current was not strong enough to capsize, but it tugged with a purposeful insistence, enough to frighten and to prove that whatever the tube was designed to do, it interacted with the sea in ways that modern instruments could detect and, with effort, reproduce. Darian, who watched the marina from a glassed observation deck, smiled in a manner that did not reach his eyes. News of the micro-event leaked. Conspiracy threads lit up. Proto-energy device, ancient weaponized tide tech, corporate control of the sea. Governments exchanged thinly veiled inquiries. Miriam's phone filled with messages, some desperate, some cordial, some vaguely threatening. The museum sealed the lattice deeper within its vaults. The consortium argued about public statements. Some wanted to warn the world of a possible danger, others wanted silence until they had more data. In the middle of this, Noor found herself suddenly important enough to be ignored. That night, after an argument with a representative who threatened to pull funding if access remained restricted, Miriam walked onto the museum's roof to escape the hum of polite panic. The city below was a carpet of light and muffled voices. Jonah sat with his camera between his knees. His footage of the team at the reef had already begun to gather shapes and posts, faces, fragments of the prism's etchings, horizons. "They're going to weaponize the pattern," Jonah said, not as prediction but as observation. "Someone will eventually see utility in it." "It's always utility," Miriam said. "Utility is the arid bed where everything living dies." Jonah's face keyed into a softer question. "Do you ever think the people who built such things imagined them as weapons?" Miriam watched the sea beyond the city. The moon's path silvered the water with a crooked line. "Perhaps not weapons in the way we think. Control of currents is control of commerce. Control of commerce is control of people. Whoever built the arrays likely understood the political nature of engineering." The implication sat between them like a ghost. If control followed discovery, and if discovery invited actors with less reverence than curiosity, then they were at the center of a game whose rules had not been written. Noor, meanwhile, had an encounter the books did not prepare her for. She arranged a meeting with a woman named Layla Iskandar, a keeper of oral histories who ran a small cultural center by the docks. Layla's center was a room of weathered shutters, antique fishing nets, and stringed instruments that looked as if they might, with the right touch, recall a melody older than memory. Layla had been a bridge between academic curiosity and local custodianship for decades. Her hair was the color of iron, and her face had the map of seas lived through. "Samir's family called me last night," Layla said, her fingers at rest on a small carved oar. "They remember the boy who would sit on the rocks and listen. They remember a knot of men who walked out before storms. They called them the Circle." "The Circle?" Noor repeated. Layla nodded. "They were not a guild in the tidy sense. Families, fishermen, a few craftsmen, men and women who agreed to do the delicate work of tending the shelf. They taught each other where to moor, how to read the chorus of sea foam, how to avoid the teeth of a current. They also hid objects, out of fear or reverence or both. They called it keeping the song. When goods came from far away, sometimes the keepers would mark the boxes so sailors knew to respect the place." "Why hide devices?" Noor asked. "Because knowledge that lets you change the sea is dangerous," Layla said, and her voice was like wind over shore pebbles. "Not just because it can harm, but because people forget humility when they possess the means to remake where others live." Noor left with more threads than answers. She began to map living memories against archaeological traces. Layla's circle matched margins in merchant logs and a few late Coptic hymns that made oblique reference to keepers of the low songs. The pattern grew like a slow bloom. The more Noor dug, the clearer it became that the lattice and its sisters were never singly owned. They had been dispersed, tended, and sometimes concealed by a community whose rules were enforced not by law but by reputation and silence. If a private compound could coax the water into small oddities, the implication was terrifying. If the circle had hidden arrays to prevent misuse, then the thefts and the private experiments had set into motion the unraveling of an old pact. And so the story tightened its grip on those who had found it. A high-level delegation arrived in the city, dressed in linen and steel, bearing the insignia of a regional coalition. They requested, not unreasonably, that artifacts be handed to a neutral team pending international review. Miriam found the request both reasonable and impossible. Once an object had been exposed to technology and commerce, neutral custodianship was a fantasy. The coalition's envoy, a woman named Ambassador Irina Sokol, met with Miriam privately. Irina's eyes were the color of a sea in winter. Her voice was trained not to betray. "We want cooperation," she said. "This discovery could unsettle trade and navigation. There will be calls for regulation." "There already are," Miriam said. "And threats." Irina's face softened briefly into a human expression. "Then we must ensure the means of applying such knowledge do not fall into hands that would use it to coerce." Miriam looked at Irina and felt the room tilt. Ambassadors spoke of restraint the way priests spoke of penance. Yet in other rooms, closed to the public, men like Darian spoke of harnessing. Power was not a simple binary. It was a spectrum of uses and misuses. The tension resolved into action neither of them liked. The museum agreed, under pressure from several directions, to transfer a sealed portion of the lattice to the coalition's supervised custody for joint analysis. Nor, Elias, and Miriam protested, citing the theft and the need for transparent chain of custody protocols. The public, starved for drama, applauded the coalition's responsible-seeming step. On the morning the crate was to be moved, Jonah's feed captured an image that would not leave him: a gray dawn, a convoy rolling down the quay, a crane lifting a weathered case. The day smelled of salt and oil. As the crate was loaded onto a vessel flagged in neutral colors, a sudden, subtle change in the harbor occurred, so slight that most people did not notice, but a diver in an observation boat did. The diver felt a tug at his tether, a slow pressure that seemed to want to pull him away from shore. He saw, briefly, before waves smudged the clarity, a ribbon of white water spiral from the crate's direction out into the harbor, like a breath exhaled into the sea. By the time Miriam, Noor, and the team reached the quay, the convoy was already steaming. Cameras had caught images of a current aft of the ship that made small craft veer. People spoke of coincidence, mechanical failure, the caprice of the harbor. But Jonah's footage, when slowed, showed that the pattern of the water had a geometry, an elliptical wake that did not match the vessel's motion. No one declared a cause. No one wanted to speak about the possibility that the stolen tube had been activated and somehow transmitted a signature the lattice recognized. Yet the harbor had changed, imperceptibly and irrevocably. The circle's old warnings, "Do not remove the song from the shore," began, for those who thought to listen, to make their own small kind of sense. That evening, as storm clouds gathered on an indifferent horizon, Miriam sat with Noor and Elias, their faces lit by the microscope's cold glow. They were scholars and, increasingly, players in a game whose rules were being written as they moved. Noor tapped an etching on the prism image, tracing a line no thicker than a sigh. "If they are arrays," she said at last, "then they are meant to work together. Remove one and the pattern changes. Remove many and..." She let the sentence trail, and all of them understood the unstated end. Outside, a gull cried as if warning, and somewhere beyond the breakwater, in the darkening sea, something moved with a rhythm older than their institutions. The storm arrived like an argument, quick, loud, and finally indifferent. Rain hammered the old city and turned the quay into a silver sheet. For a night the harbor forgot its mind and the lights along the promenades smeared into a single, trembling line. The coalition vessel put to sea earlier than planned, its hull a dark promise disappearing into the rain. People told each other that storms had a way of washing away small panics. The truth, quieter and colder, was that storms could also reveal what had been hidden. In the small hours, with the museum's heavy doors bolted and the city breathing under the storm spell, an alarm shrilled in the conservation lab. Noor, who slept badly and kept her phone on the nightstand like a guard, was the first to respond. She ran across tiles still slick from the quick rinse the rain had given them and found, under the laboratory's motion sensors, a single glass shard on the floor, fine, curved, part of a tube. A panel in the display case was neatly cut, the foam lining gouged where hands had worked with practiced care. The lattice itself sat whole in its crate, but a prism, one of the smallest components, a hexagonal face the size of a coin, was missing. They called the police. They called the coalition's liaison. Someone called Darian, though there was nothing he could do from whatever safe place his calls reached him. The theft, while smaller than the first, carried a new and personal sting. Someone had come into the museum with knowledge and left with the knowledge of what to take. Miriam felt the theft like a physical bruise. She moved through the museum with the gait of someone who had learned to govern both patience and fury. Patterns, she told Nor and Elias, who attended the scene with the fatigued attention of those who had already given too much to this work. They are looking for the right pieces to make the system sing. Nor's jaw worked. Why take the small ones? Why not the lattice itself? Because you can transport a prism in a pocket, Elias said. You can test it, tune it, and learn the local syntax without drawing the attention a full lattice would bring. Small things teach you how large things behave. It was an observation of craft as much as of motive. Someone very careful, someone who knew the language of materials, was building a grammar. The next week moved in fits. A conference call with the coalition produced blunt assurances and promises of increased security. Darien made vague philanthropic offers that smelled of acquisition. A private investigator in a cheap raincoat slipped into Nor's path and left a card like a threat disguised as curiosity. The circle's whispers grew. Layla Iskandar, who had the stubborn patience of those who tend small community archives, told Nor in a voice hushed by candles that the keepers had always said the song could be recalled by a key and sung by an array. The word key sat in the air between them like an accusation. Nor found herself walking, one dawn, with a fisherman who had once been a boy when Samir Haddad still kept watch. They crossed a laundry line of nets and the smell of a century of diesel. His eyes were banded with the fatigue of a life lived to watch and wait. We used to know where the lattice pieces slept, he said. Old men put them in places where only water and weather could find them if they returned. We were not proud of what we hid. We were afraid of what others would do. Who hid them? Nor asked. Not men you hear of in speeches, he said. Riggers, stonecutters, a potter who loved the sea more than money. Sometimes ladies of households whose sons were lost at sea. We were many. We were not always wise. Nor left with the sense that history had been kept by hands not recorded in ledgers. The keepers had made choices out of fear and conscience, and now the past was unraveling because others chose differently. As the coalition's remote-operated vehicles mapped the submerged structure in higher resolution, they found rows of cavities where niches once cradled devices, many still empty. One ROV, in the scrape of its cameras, caught a flash of metal under barnacle and silt. A recovery diver, suited against the cold, descended and pried loose a corroded clasp and then a small bronze plaque, round as a palm. Its surface was etched with a line of glyphs that none in the coalition's immediate team could read. Nor, who had learned the patient art of pattern recognition, saw that the glyphs echoed the prism's micro-etchings folded into something larger, a seal, a maker's mark. When she traced the glyphs against the margins of the merchant's notes, and the scribe's circular sketch, the match was not exact but kin. The pattern repeated in fragments across sites with as much regularity as a dialect reproduces speech. Someone, or some tradition, had stamped their work with a sign, and that sign had become a thread. The work of deciphering the glyphs drew a new scholar into their orbit, Dr. Matteo Varela, a linguist whose specialization in proto-seafaring notation was as obscure as Nor's earlier interests had been. Matteo's arrival felt, at first, like the relief of a lamp in a cold room. He had the soft, patient presence of a man who had made languages his home, and when he ran the glyphs through comparative matrices he found something both tantalizing and unnerving. The glyphs were partly numeric, partly symbolic. Their structure implied an idea of sequence and alignment, of synchrony across nodes. When placed against tidal tables for a particular year several centuries before the Common Era, the pattern aligned with lunar standstills, times when the moon's declination reached its extremes and tidal forces followed unusual patterns. It suggests synchronization, Matteo said at the whiteboard, where he had arranged constellations of marks like stars. Not merely mapping. A clocking, a way to time interventions with the natural rhythm of the sea. The phrase, time interventions, reframed everything. If the arrays could be tuned to lunar cycles, they could amplify or dampen specific tidal events. It was a subtle mastery, far from the cataclysmic idea of weapons, but the control it offered could bend commerce and the fate of ports. A port silting, a river's mouth, a fishery's bounty, Each could be nudged with patience rather than force. A slow, patient coercion. In the weeks that followed, the stakes turned social and then legal. Coastal towns petitioned the coalition for assurances. Insurance firms recalculated risks. A senator from a trading nation issued a statement urging caution and international oversight. Against this rising chorus, Darien's engineers worked in public and private, demonstrating, before accredited observers, that certain patternings of flow were repeatable in a controlled basin. They did not, in those demonstrations, replicate the scale of the ancient arrays. They hoped merely to show possibility. The demonstrations were elegant, and they were marketed like an inevitability. Miriam watched these developments with the careful indignation of one who trusted process over statement. She testified before a panel convened by the coalition, and in her guarded testimony she argued for open science and community rights. "This is not merely a matter of discovery," she told the panel. "It is a matter of stewardship. The people who live by the sea must have a voice in what we do with relics that so fundamentally affect their lives." Her words earned press quotes and private resentment. Darien's representatives called them idealistic and untenable, as if the two were interchangeable. The coalition's diplomats, by temperament, preferred the language of consensus. Meanwhile, the keepers watched from their faded benches by the docks and whispered of a world in which the past would be monetized into leverage. Then, in the quiet of a late autumn night, the consortium's security protocol failed spectacularly in a way no one predicted. A server, one of the team's central data arrays, was infiltrated. Digital logs, research notes, and the high-resolution maps of the submerged structure were siphoned. The theft was not of metal but of memory. It carried the peculiar intimacy of those who wanted not objects, but understanding. Someone, somewhere, cleaner and more modern than the old keepers, wanted the blueprint. They suspected a private firm with the reach and the habit of acquiring knowledge, a defense contractor with ties to Darien, a murky corporate entity with a philanthropic arm and a history of advisory grants. Darien disavowed involvement in the breach. The coalition promised an investigation. Miriam and Noor, who had heretofore been content to watch evidence accumulate, suddenly found themselves in the precarious posture of those who must guard not only artifacts but information. The theft changed the tenor of Noor's nights. She began to dream not of lattices but of lists, sequences of coordinates, each one associated with a family name, a small stone with a spiral, a fishing net folded in a precise way. In waking she began to map living memory with a mania that terrified Miriam and fueled Elias's admiration. "You are turning into one of them," Elias said once, meaning the keepers, and meaning it as praise. "I am trying to be useful," Noor said. "Useful in a way that keeps things from being misused." Her search bore fruit in an unexpected place, an attic above a cafe where an elderly woman who had once mended sails kept a trunk of letters written in a child's stiff hand. The letters were between two brothers who had sailed different coasts. One became a mason, the other never returned from a fishing voyage. In the margin of a letter the mason had drawn a small circle and annotated it with a crude set of glyphs. The drawing had a date. The date was a year that matched, with maddening closeness, the range Matteo had suggested when he aligned the prism glyphs with lunar cycles. Noor began to suspect that the keepers had not merely hidden things, they had, over centuries, encoded who knew what in songs, in knots, in letters kept like talismans. Their knowledge had been both social and technical. To take the technical without the social was to tear a fabric sewn from generations. The midwinter months pulled taut across the city. Weather hardened. Voices hardened with it. The coalition convened a summit in which ambassadors, engineers, representatives of coastal communities, and scholars argued not only about preservation but about law. Should ancient devices be considered cultural patrimony, beyond market and commerce, or technological knowledge that, once understood, belonged to all humanity? Definitions slid beneath the weight of power. Amid the political tussle, a private contact reached Miriam. The message was delivered by a courier with no face, a single phrase, written on a card of thick paper, folded and slipped into her palm as she left a lecture. The phrase, in a script that was neither fully modern nor wholly ancient, read, Find the ledger beneath the bell. It was the kind of prompt that could be a prank, a trap, or a genuine lead. Miriam took it as the latter. Bell towers, she knew, held histories. Churches and ports had once stored the logs of traders beneath their floors. She went, alone, to the cathedral at the edge of the old quarter, its nave smelling of old wood and prayer. In the stone beneath the bell, she found a trapdoor half-flagged by moss. The ledger beneath it was a logbook the size of a small coffin, its pages packed with entries from centuries that had seen more sails than flags. Within the ledger were lines of merchant accounts and notations, some practical, barrels of grain, quantities of olive oil, some cryptic, the phrase, "For the keep of the low song, 1 slab," and dates that matched several archaeological strata. In a folded page, wrapped in oilcloth, she found a map, not a map of coasts but of nodes, places on the shelf where devices had once rested, with margin notes in a script she recognized now as a sort of shorthand, names of families, initials, an admonition to bind to the tide and not the traitor. Miriam sat with the ledger under the cathedral's dim light and felt the first real sensation of being part of a long conversation. The ledger was not a blueprint for a machine so much as a covenant, a record of choices made by people who loved trade and feared being made its prisoners. The ledger showed a pattern of concealment and care, of ancient agreements recorded in the language of commerce. Outside the cathedral, the city continued to argue. Inside, with the ledger open, Miriam understood a little more about the moral geometry of the keepers. They had not only hidden devices, they had written rules into the ledger: who could take, who could know, and under what conditions things could be taught. Those rules were not legal in a modern sense but social, enforced by reputation and, when necessary, by closing lines of trade. The discovery of the ledger should have clarified matters. Instead, it deepened them. If the ledger were authentic, and every evidence in Miriam's long career told her this one was, it implied both knowledge and an authority that neither modern states nor private firms possessed. It suggested the existence of custodial communities with their own claims that could be mobilized either to restore stewardship or to contest modern appropriation. By the time the first snows dusted the higher hills inland, the city's quiet had become a hum. Darien courted investors with promises of regulated tidal energy. The coalition pressed for an international protocol that would, on paper, protect the sea and its relics. The keepers, fragmented and aged, tried to assemble a voice, and Nadia Iskandar, Layla's daughter, younger but with the same stubborn clarity, emerged as an interlocutor between communities and scholars. Noor, who had chased marginalia into attics, now stood at the intersection of memory and method. Miriam felt, with a scientist's habitual modesty, that she was finally hearing a pattern that extended beyond devices, a cultural ethic encoded in practice. Yet the stolen data and the siphoned servers meant someone else could read the pattern too. Knowledge moves like water in the modern world. Once in the currents, it finds outlets. The question was not whether people could recover the technology's mechanics. The evidence suggested they could in time, but what intentions would guide that recovery? The year ended without definitive answers. The arrays remained, mostly, a scattered mystery. The lattice lay guarded. Small prisms and tubes had been moved or pirated. The keepers had surfaced from the margins with names and grievances and with an argument they had never had the chance to make on the world stage. The politicians talked. The engineers schemed. The sea kept its counsel. On the last night before the new year, Miriam stood on the quay, the ledger folded in her bag like a small treasure, and watched as the harbor lights blinked against the water. A boy on a fishing skiff beat a rhythm on his rudder, keeping a time older than the clocks in the square. Somewhere under the surface, the stone grid waited, patient as a story. Above it, in rooms both elegant and crude, men and women prepared to interpret, to use, and to guard knowledge that might remake coastlines, commerce, and the lives of those who lived by the sea. Miriam thought of the ledger's admonition to bind knowledge to the tide and not the trader. She thought of Noor's mapped memories and Layla's stories and of Darian's smooth smile. The past, she realized, had not so much been discovered as returned, offered back to a modern world that had changed in ways the keepers could never have predicted. She did not know how the coming year would settle these questions. She only knew what scholars always know in their marrow, that understanding begets responsibility. The lattice and its sisters were, in the truest sense, a test, not merely of human ingenuity, but of human restraint. And in the hush between storms and obligations, that test had only just begun. They called it the Winter Accord, the coalition's glossy response to a year of rumors, thefts, and quiet panic. Delegates gathered in a vaulted hall, reporters polished their leads, and analysts prepared the charts that made catastrophe legible in degrees. The accord promised transparency and oversight. It promised funds for conservation and for the communities that had kept the song. It promised, too, an international registry of known nodes, an attempt to turn a scattered, secret geography into a public dataset. For the keepers, the registry felt like a cold lantern whose light might expose the places they had once hidden for survival. Miriam read the accord for the pragmatism it offered and the naivete it betrayed. Agreements look better in ink than in practice. The ledger beneath the bell had taught her the arithmetic of human bargains. A promise can be as fragile as mortar. She stood with Noor and Matteo in a margin of the hall, watching as diplomats clasped wrists and engineers traded handshakes that were both firm and tactical. "This will make things safer," Ambassador Sokol said into a microphone, her voice the flatness of someone accustomed to balancing national wills. Noor brushed the paper of her notes in absent-minded agitation. "It will also mark where people used to hide," she murmured. "It will tell everyone where the vulnerabilities are." Matteo, whose face tended toward astonishment even when he meant to be guarded, looked up. "There must be a way to include living communities in the registry's governance," he said. "Not merely as stakeholders to consult, but as co-authors of policy." A small round of applause answered him, polite, not passionate. Words did not yet hold the weight of sea-weathered vows. While the accord attempted to make the world orderly, the private and the shadowed grew busier. Darien, who had the discretion of deep pockets, chartered research vessels and leased laboratories with an ease that made the coalition's bureaucrats look like village clerks. His engineers worked in low light and high confidentiality, and their grants funded a network that wrapped the academic community like a vine. They shared some data with the coalition, carefully selected fragments that suggested capability without offering operational recipes. To those who watched, Darien's displays were both seductive and immaculate, small pools in which currents could, by careful tuning, be pulled into new cadences. Not everyone received these demonstrations as marvels. Fishermen complained of netted shoals that suddenly thinned. A marina reported a week of confused tides that left small craft stranded on awkward shoals. Darien's teams called the incidents anomalies, the kind of statistical noise that accompanies new experimentation. But a pattern is only ever noise until a theory makes it sing. Noor and Matteo continued their close work on the glyphs. Matteo's breakthrough came not from any single epigraphic sleight but from forcing the symbols into the grammar of sound. He treated the glyphs as notation rather than mere marks, scores for the sea. When he arranged the glyphs along the lunar calendar, and then tested the patterns against recorded variations in fish migration and tidal harmonics, the results were unsettling. Certain glyph sequences coincided with changes in current eddies and with anomalous concentrations of plankton at predictable times. The lattices, he began to argue, were neither clocks nor purely mechanical transducers. They were a form of notation that instructed arrays to interact with cyclic phenomena in a rhythm the builders had understood intimately. "If the glyphs tell a machine how to sing with the sea," Matteo said in a hushed seminar, "then they are both instruction and etiquette. The builders encoded the times to act as much as the ways." Elias, who worked nightly in the lab to model resonance, found Matteo's notion both thrilling and terrifying. When Elias built a small array, a modern approximation, cautious and crude, and fed it a sequence derived from Matteo's notation, sensors registered changes in microcurrents and in low-frequency acoustic fields. The effect was subtle, like the difference between a whisper and a hum, but it registered in living systems. Plankton density near the array shifted measurably in controlled basins. "Changes in plankton," Elias said, staring at the output, "translates up the food chain. Move the plankton, and you nudge where fish feed." Nudge fish, and you nudge fishermen's livelihoods. That is not a weapon of destruction, it is a mechanism of influence. Words like influence are politically softer but can be morally sharper. Influence could be used to steer a harbor into prosperity, or to choke a rival's trade with the patient cruelty of ecology. In the wrong hands, and hands with the reach of modern logistics are never wrong in the same way twice, influence becomes strategy. As the Accord's registry took shape, the keepers contested its terms. In a smoky backroom of the cultural center, Layla and Nadia Iskandar argued with coalition lawyers, their voices worn thin by negotiation fatigue. You cannot list our sacred cove and assume it will be protected by signatures, Layla said. Our knowledge is not a line on a map. It is alive. If you pull it into a registry, you make it a file, and files leak. The lawyers countered with the patient certainty of legal minds. Nadia, younger and sharper than her mother in many practical ways, proposed an alternative, a framework of consent where any intervention required affirmative agreement from local councils, and where technical knowledge would only be shared under binding cultural patrimony clauses. The coalition, pressed by Darian's funding and the clamor of stakeholders, agreed to consider the scheme, but the compromise dissolved slowly in the solvent of competing interests. Amid the diplomacy, the shadow actors accelerated. A fleet operator with known ties to a defense contractor hired divers who came out of contract work on subsea cables. Under the cover of salvage rights, they sought nodes indicated by the siphoned server logs. In two small incidents, one a careful excavation of a cove, another the retrieval of a stone block marked with the maker's glyphs, their teams found fragments they could smuggle away. Jonah, whose camera habits had turned him into a relentless collector of truth, began to catch odd, anonymized images that suggested a widening net. He showed Miriam a grainy clip one evening, late, in the editing trailer, midnight, engines low, a small boat slipping through the rain. The clip trembled with static, but Jonah had enhanced it to show two figures moving in sync, experienced hands that handled corroded metal like instruments. Someone with money, skill, and what was reconstructing the pattern node by node, prism by prism. Miriam felt the old ledger's admonition like a second heartbeat. The keepers had hidden pieces for the world to forget. The modern world, with its speed and appetite, preferred to remember everything and to exploit what memory offered. She convened a small meeting with Noor, Matteo, Elias, Layla, and Nadia in the museum's back room. The air smelled of coffee and the antiseptic tang of the conservation lab. We cannot stop knowledge, Miriam said plainly. But we can slow its misuse, and we can insist on governance that honors the communities who steward this knowledge. If we do nothing, the pattern will be reconstituted by those who think in profit. Layla's face, lined with years of watching men speak for history they did not live, softened. If you bind it to law, she said, you bind it to the hunger of those who make law speak for power. Our agreements were old because they were social. They relied on people recognizing the cost of forgetting. We need a way to make modern institutions understand that cost. Noor proposed a radical idea, a living archive, a network of steward nodes run by local communities and scholars in partnership. The archive would be decentralized, technical knowledge accessible only through community consent and with safeguards that made malicious replication difficult. Matteo suggested adding redundancy by encoding cultural context into the technical notation, building fail-safes into translations so that literal replication would require community mediation. The plan was moonshot. It demanded trust where trust barely existed, and it demanded power sharing from institutions loath to cede control. But it had momentum. The Accord's idealists found it appealing because it offered a path between secrecy and open commercialization. While policy moved at the pace of committees, practical events sped up. A rival nation, small, ambitious, and heavily maritime, announced an experimental coastal engineering project that, in its draft diagrams, bore disturbing resemblance to the map geometries the coalition had disclosed. The project claimed to be an ecological restoration of bay sediment and marshlands, but maritime economists noticed that the proposed changes would advantage certain ports while disadvantaging others. The disclosure prompted protests from unions, worried port authorities, and an avalanche of op-eds. The project's public relations team pointed to the accord and insisted on international best practices. Behind closed doors, shipping interests kissed their palms and counted potential savings. Miriam read the engineering diagrams with a scientist's nausea. The proposed structures, while plausible in general coastal management, reflected an uncanny precision in node spacing and vector alignments, the kind one sees when someone has read a pattern and plans to reuse it, not reinvent it. She sent a quiet note to Ambassador Sokol attaching Mateo's comparative analysis. Sokol, who had seen the politics of maritime advantage before, sent Miriam back a terse reply. She would raise the matter in the next summit. The summit convened under a sky as thin and pale as milk. Representatives talked of ethics and protection, while satellites traced trade ships in indifferent arcs above them. In a corridor, Miriam caught Jonah, who thrust a USB at her. "You need to see this," he said. "I pulled it from an unlisted feed. The divers who took the prism? They worked with a salvage company whose clients include firms registered to Darian's people." Miriam pocketed the drive like a small blade. Evidence is rarely neat. It is a collage of partial truths that only grow coherent with patience and a willingness to accept complexity. She began to suspect that the world would not resolve around accords and registries. It would resolve around the uneven application of power. The decisive event did not come in a boardroom. It came in the soft technology of rumor and a public's thin patience. Fishers in one small port, a town that had opposed Darian's funding from the first day, woke to dead nets. Not great shoals, but enough to make a season's difference. Tests found no poisons. Instead, the fish had moved with a kind of purpose, abandoned waters they had frequented for generations. Scientists argued until their words were exhausted. Fishermen cursed until words turned to action. The town staged a protest that drew cameras. In the press crush, a young fisher named Sammy, son of a keeper who had been promised a place in any modern stewardship plan, stood on the quay and shouted what he had heard in the taverns and among the nets. "They sing for us when they want. They stop singing when they don't." The phrase, simple and furious, carried a potency that policy papers lack. It forced the world to see the human shape of the artifact's impact. The summit, which had intended to be a measured exercise of diplomacy, turned into a scramble to prevent local unrest from deciding the story. Something else rippled under the surface. Mateo, late one night, called Nor with a voice that trembled between awe and dread. He had pushed the glyph analysis further, aligning notation with records of ancient plague cycles and a Coptic hymn that spoke of the sleeping chords under the salt. There, tucked in the margins of a monastery transcription he had found in a microfilm archive, he traced a passing notation, a ritual calendar that synchronized not only with lunar standstills but with migratory cycles of whales and with certain bloom timings of bioluminescent algae. "Whatever the arrays do," he said, careful in his words, "they touch life. They don't only move water. They move life that moves with water." The realization turned policy arguments into moral ones. Influence on fish is influence on human livelihoods. Influence on migratory mammals is influence on ecosystems previously indifferent to human designs. The deeper the team looked, the less contemptible the idea of using arrays merely for advantage seemed. Its consequences grew in density and moral consequence. That winter, as snow lay on inland hills and the sea sighed with old rhythms, the coalition's registry stalled in committees. Darian increased his public demonstrations and his private acquisitions. The keepers dug in. Nadia organized community assemblies that demanded veto power over any intervention in their nodes. Under the surface of diplomacy, private actors continued their work. Prisms were reassembled in clandestine labs, vectors tested in experimental basins, and the song of the sea coaxed by men with the will to make it sing. Miriam found herself pulled between her archival love for the ledger's patient lines and the urgency Nor carried like an ache. "We must build the living archive," Nor insisted, late into one night, her hands restless on a mug that had long since cooled. "We must make it tangible before the pattern is stitched by those who think only in profit." Miriam wanted to believe. She scanned a world in which law, ethic, and local consent could bend the arc of technology away from domination. History, she had learned, rarely offered such tidy fates. But there are moments when a coalition of people, diverse in skill, quiet in passion, can deflect a current. In the weeks that followed, they began to try. They gathered community leaders, drafted governance frameworks, and reached out to sympathetic jurisdictions. They worked with independent engineers to design mechanical make-safes, braces and interlocks whose removal required communal knowledge and whose operation demanded consent. The idea was to create artifactual throttles, physical and social mechanisms that made unilateral reactivation impossible. The make-safes were both brilliant and impractical. They required craftsmanship and community buy-in. Several keepers, aged and skeptical, trusted no machinery but the sea itself. Others saw in make-safes the chance to keep the song while allowing livelihood to flourish sustainably. Meanwhile, in a warehouse behind a desalination company, a team with a ledger of its own reassembled prisms into a lattice. The air smelled of copper and scented oil. The team was precise, professional, and impatient. They did not think as the keepers had. For them, influence was a lever, and levers are meant to be used. They planned tests on a scale small enough to avoid attention but large enough to show potential. On the morning their assembled lattice activated, the sea at the experimental base shuddered with the careful modesty of the ancient devices. Buoys orbited in patterns that mattered. Sensors fed back numbers that made engineers unaccustomed to ethical pain giddy. In a lab 2 continents away, a financier checked her models and smiled. Jonah, who had a way of following shadowed currents, captured the small event. He sent the clip to Miriam with no caption. She watched the sequence of water patterns and felt, clearly and sharply, the moral weight of the moment. It was not a disaster. It was not yet catastrophe. It was, instead, a demonstration that the pattern could be reconstructed by modern hands with modern priorities. Miriam stopped a meeting mid-sentence and addressed the room. "We have a decision," she said. "We can build a living archive and ask the world to be patient, or we can let the pattern be stitched by those who do not share our ethics. Either way, history will remember us for the choice we made." In the hush that followed, the ledger in her bag felt like a compass. Outside, gulls argued above in different waves. The music the glyphs encoded was not finished being written. Somewhere, beneath stone and silt, the lattice's sisters waited, silent, patient, and possible. And in the dark, a team with their own ledger watched the tides and planned their next test. The sea kept its counsel, and the human race, slow, eager, and often wrong, continued its old work of deciding how to use the past. They called it, in polite and desperate language, the reckoning. The clandestine activation in the experimental bay, small, precise, and demonstrative, had broken the fragile patience the winter accord had attempted to cultivate. Ports that depended on centuries-old rhythms registered losses. A small fishing town lost an autumn haul that could not be explained away as market fluctuation. Pressure that had once been private now moved through the public like a tide through river mouth. Governments that had preferred the language of committees turned their eyes toward enforcement. What followed was not a single dramatic showdown but the slow, messy work of human institutions finding their stride. The Living Archive campaign, once a risky ideal proposed in the back room of a museum, found its first champions among those whose lives the arrays most directly touched. Nadia Iskandar convened a council of keepers and municipal leaders and, with Matteo and Noor at her side, proposed a framework that married technical safekeeping to community control. The archive would be distributed, repositories in coastal towns, waterlogged ledgers preserved in dry vaults, and a set of legal instruments that linked any technical disclosure to the consent of local stewards. It was imperfect. It was political, and politics makes poor companions for pure ethics. But it had force and legitimacy, and the coalition, ragged around the edges, eager for a win, endorsed a pilot program. The pilot began in 3 small ports where the keeper's authority was still living and coherent. Craftsmen were taught how to build physical make-safes that could only be assembled or disassembled by combinations of communal knowledge and ritualized practice. Engineers encoded cultural signifiers into the notation itself, sequences that required not only mechanical reproduction but social validation. Darien, who had expected the deft malleability of capital to suffice, found himself in a different theater. Public scandal hit his demonstration projects hard. Investors, cautious in the face of bad press tied to livelihoods, withdrew or demanded ironclad oversight. His private teams continued their work in shadowed labs. They made progress. Fragments of the notation coalesced. They could produce localized effects. Yet the models they built in sterile basins failed to predict the fuller, messy responses of real ecosystems and human economies. The sea, it turned out, was not merely a set of vectors but a conversation partner. When you tweak one strand, others reply in ways a model did not always capture. A small, unintended calamity finally forced a reckoning. A reconstructed lattice, activated without full restraint, altered current patterns near a narrow strait. It did not drown a city or sink ships. It did something more politically damning. It rerouted a migratory shoal for an entire season, funneling fish away from communities that had planned harvests to feed children. The outrage was local, immediate, and human. Photos of empty nets and children with thin faces made their way across networks. Politicians could not ignore what scientists discussed in measured terms. The scandal, unlike a technical failure, had names and faces. It was a turning point for the coalition. International regulators, spurred by public outcry rather than bureaucratic idealism, moved to legally bind research into community frameworks. The living archive gained teeth, consent clauses became enforceable. Violation of stewardship could mean sanctions and, in some jurisdictions, criminal charges. The institutions that had practiced quiet acquisition without regard to local rule found their options constrained. Some adapted, others pursued their goals in jurisdictions with laxer oversight. But legal instruments can only do so much. The keeper's power, in the end, lay in culture and memory. Nadia convened a council that included young sailors, older potters, and women who had kept the names of coves as a ledger in their heads. They devised rituals, mundane, human acts that integrated care into daily life, nets folded in certain ways, an evening song sung before setting out, a protocol for reporting anomalies. These acts, while symbolic, were also practical. They made the knowledge performative and communal. To operate the arrays, an outsider needed not only a device but a social key. Matteo encoded these cultural keys into the notational grammar so that technical replication required cultural mediation. Noor worked on pedagogy. She built programs that taught both the science of the arrays and the social context that made them ethical. Children who had heard the old songs in their mothers' kitchens learned to read the glyphs as both music and instruction. They learned the ledger's lines and the names of families that had kept them. The living archive, imperfect as it was, began to fold time. It preserved technique and the memory of why certain knowledge had to be handled with restraint. Miriam found herself in a role she had not sought, less a lone scholar than a bridge. She testified in hearings, she taught in the pilot programs, and she sat, often late, with old keepers and young students, translating ledger lines into accessible, human terms. She watched, with a scientist's unease, how knowledge circulated. It still did, as knowledge always does, yet now it moved under watch and with commitments that were written, argued, and sometimes contested. The ledger beneath the bell remained in her care, but copies, carefully redacted and community-endorsed, found homes in the archive nodes. Not every conflict ended with justice. Some prisms remained missing. Private operators reconstructed partial arrays in remote basins and conducted experiments the world never fully learned about. A small faction, either purely villain nor hero, chose to believe that they could steer the sea toward abundance without heed of local voice. Their arrogance sometimes produced gains, sometimes ecological harm. The story of the lattice had no tidy moral. It had the ragged truth of human contradiction. The climax of the saga was not a single catastrophic unmaking but a sharp ethical moment that crystallized the stakes. A coalition vessel, carrying experts and community liaisons, met a private chartered ship offshore where Darien's engineers had scheduled a public demonstration. The crowd, reporters, local fishermen, and delegates, watched as engineers unveiled a scaled lattice intended to showcase beneficial influence, a small redirection of a current to clear silt from a harbor mouth. The demonstration proceeded. For a moment the water shimmered with promise. Then, as if reminding the watchers of the sea's own intelligence, an unexpected eddy grew, nets in a neighboring cove shifted, seabirds changed their path. A small boy on the quay, who had learned the old songs, yelled from the crowd, "The sea answers for itself!" The demonstration halted. Cameras reoriented from marvel to question. The architects of the private lattice faced the complicated law of consequence. The living archive acquired a new ally. Public skepticism joined with technical literacy to demand that any deployment prove not only efficacy but just benefit sharing. The world was not saved by one institution but nudged by many, by law, by culture, by the stubborn ethical work of communities who had refused to be sidelined. In the months that followed, the living archive grew into a model for other contested technologies, places where ecological complexity and local livelihoods intertwined with engineering. Scholars published tempered work that emphasized not weapons or windfalls but the ethics of the possible. Matteo's theories about notation and rituals spread into lectureships. Noor's pedagogy trained a new cadre of guardians who could speak the language of both microprobes and market boards. Miriam grew older in the arc of those years. Her hair silvered at the temples. Her hands kept the small shudder of someone who had spent decades coaxing story from soil. She returned often to the ledger beneath the bell, which she now understood as less a map than a conversation between those who made and those who lived beside the sea. The ledger had guided a generation to a practical, if partial, solution, one that demanded humility and an ongoing commitment to consent. Yet the sea kept other things. In the late watches of certain nights, fishermen still spoke of lights that did not belong to town and of a boat that crept where no local knew its name. Jonah's footage, when he had the patience to sort it, caught hints: an unclaimed crate at a neutral port, a scrap of notation on the underside of a shipping manifest. Technology, like water, finds cracks. The lattice's sisters, some lost and some deliberately hidden, remained possibilities in the world. In the story's last scenes, Miriam stood once more on the quay where she had first watched the lattice's filigree glint in the morning sun. The harbor was quieter now in a stabilizing way. Children practiced songs on the promenade as Noor taught them the basics of notation. Layla watched, and Nadia negotiated a coastal development plan that respected both commerce and covenants. Elias taught repair and restraint to engineers who once believed raw capability was the only virtue. Darian had become, in the public imagination, at once a cautionary tale and an ambiguous benefactor, his private work curtailed, his resources redirected, his ambition out of step with new norms. Miriam opened the ledger beneath the bell one last time in the light that pooled from a winter afternoon. She traced, with a finger that remembered many late nights, the merchant's margin notes, and the scribe's circle. The ledger had not solved the lattice, it had bridged lives. It had shown that knowledge, once found, must be bound by human agreements willed into being by people who learned, painfully and at cost, that restraint is a technology as subtle and necessary as any transducer. She folded the ledger closed and felt, finally, the quiet satisfaction of a conclusion that was neither triumphant nor tragic. The archive would need tending. The prisms that remained missing might someday surface in hands both kind and cruel. New notation might be derived from old and misapplied. The sea, indifferent and alive, would go on, singing in patterns older than any treaty. Miriam left the museum and walked to the quay. The wind smelled of salt and of a small, resilient future. Children sang, fishermen mended nets, and in a low cove a team of young stewards calibrated a small sensor array that would report anomalies to the living archive. Noor waved from across the water, her face open and tired in that promising way of those who believe work will always be needed. Jonah, camera slung over his shoulder, nodded without exaggeration. "It will change again," he said. "It always does," Miriam answered. "That is not the worst of it." They watched the harbor as dusk came, and the surface of the sea took on the slow, constant language of reflection. In the black water, The stone grid lay patient beneath silt and growth, its niches holding secrets that had been partly revealed and partly kept. Somewhere, a prism forgotten or stolen might sing when coaxed. Somewhere else, a keeper's song might be enough to quiet ambition for a season. The story closed on the ledger and on the human work of restraint. Not on certainty, because certainty had never been the sea's gift. Instead, it closed on the possibility of a stewardship that was messy, negotiated, and living, one that did not pretend to fix what time and depth alone could keep secret. They had preserved enough, argued enough, and built enough to alter the arc of who could claim power over the shore. They had not solved the lattice's deepest secrets. Those remained, in part, the sea's. The mystery would endure, because mysteries, like tides, remind the living that not every question is theirs to answer alone. Miriam turned her face to the harbor and listened. Far out, beyond the lane of fishing boats and lighted buoys, the water kept its slow, ancient chorus. It was not for any one person to command. It was for people to keep together.